Well, good morning. Welcome to New Hope. If it's your first time with us or first time in quite a while, we're glad to have you with us today. And I actually picked a really good time to join us because we're starting a brand new message series called Pause, right? Rethinking our whole pace of life. Because here's something what I know about all of us. We are all busy people, right? And let me just ask you a question. This is not a religious question in a sense. This works whether you consider yourself religious or not. But it is, I think, an important question that all of us ought to ask. Have you ever wished that life had a big pause button? I mean, wouldn't that be sweet? Something we can just reach out and hit, just to sort of catch our breath in a moment, give ourselves a little space to think, right? Or just to give us a chance to step away from whatever's happening and just pause, right? And if you've ever wished that was true, let me ask you a really important follow-up question. If we discovered we do, would that change things? I mean, the reality is, would we use it? Or would we just go on with our overstressed, overscheduled, overstimulated lives? And you may be thinking, Mike, you're kind of starting off hard today. And I'm not trying to be mean, but I am trying to help us all think. And I'm talking to myself as much as I'm talking to you. Because while I think we all wish we had that ability to hit a pause button occasionally, there's also something else we challenge. And that's what we're trying to get everything we can out of the time that we have. Some of us even more so than others, right? And the truth, and this is, again, not a religious statement, this is just a statement. We all wish we had more time, right? I've never heard anybody say, I wish I had less time. I wish I had less time to do this big project at work. I wish I had less time to get ready for my wedding, right? Wish I had less time to get ready for this big exam, right? I don't want to wish that. We all say, I wish we had more time, right? And there's certain events in our lives that remind us how much we wish we had more time. And the reality is, we all wish we had more time, and we think more time is the answer. But here's the question I want us to start with today, and we're going to consider over the next few weeks. What if it's not? What if more time isn't the answer? What if there's something that's even more important than that? So we're going to engage today. We're going to hit the pause button for just a moment. We're going to pray one more time, and then we're going to get right into what's going to be a very uncomfortable, disappointing day for a lot of us. So let's pray, all right? Lord, I thank you for this moment in time that really does help us push that pause button for just a moment. For some of us, a space like this is so important because it helps us pause the rest of our lives that at times are just so over, right? So overstressed, so overscheduled, so overdemanded, so overly challenging. And sometimes we just need a place like this to come and take a breath and pause, right? To stand and to sing, or just to sit and to listen. Just a chance for our minds to catch up with our bodies. And today my prayer for me and I think even for the rest of us is that what happened today. That maybe some words, these 3,000-year-old words, they're written by a guy who was clearly a man of God. A man who was not perfect by any stretch, but he was the perfect man that you wanted at the time in history. And I pray that his words, though at times uncomfortable, would help us begin to answer that question for ourselves. We begin to answer that need for ourselves of what if more time really isn't the answer? And if you can help us in that journey today, this will have been time well spent. In your name, amen. Hey, if you want to follow along, we're going to be over in the part of the Bible. It's in the Old Testament part. It's in the part called Psalms. And if you're not familiar with Psalms, Psalms is a collection of, in general, a collection of song lyrics. We don't have the music, we just got the lyrics there. And if you've ever gone through them, there's some that are just beautiful, some that are so poetic, some that, in fact, you learned when you were a kid, and if you hear them in any other version, any other translation, you're kind of like, that doesn't sound right because it goes this way, right? But in the midst of that, there's also some really kind of harsh ones, right? And I think it's a reminder, I'm always reminded when I read the Psalms, is that so many of them are like our song lyrics even today. Well, like some of them at least. But they are very raw, very real, and very true to where that person was at the moment. And while they talk about love, they also talk about revenge and things like that. But today we're going to look at what most scholars and theologians consider the oldest one of the Psalms. In fact, it's not even a psalm, it's actually a prayer. And it's a prayer by a guy named Moses. And if you're here, I'm guessing that you're kind of familiar with Moses, but I'm going to kind of take a big, broad swath to catch all of us up. Moses is a key figure in not just Judaism, but even in Christianity, but even in history. And the story basically goes like this. There's a boy who is born into a family who lives in Egypt. And at this moment in history, the Israel nation had gone there because of a famine. They had actually gone there just as a family, and the family kept growing and growing, and you get the idea, right? They got so big that finally the Egyptians said, hey, we got to do something about these Israelites, because they are not only productive in building the stuff we need them to build. I mean, they're called the pyramids, right? But they are productive in other ways, and they're going to outnumber us. And if anything you don't want, if you have slaves, is to have more slaves than you have people to control them, right? So they decide, hey, we're going to fix that. We're just going to make them work harder. And oh, by the way, we're going to kill all the boy babies. We'll keep the girl babies, but we're going to kill the boy babies. And so they actually go up. The Pharaoh brings in these midwives who apparently are the midwives who serve all of the Jewish, the Hebrew women, and but they're also Jewish Hebrew ladies, and they're like, they can't do it. And their explanation is, these women are just so strong, right? We can't get to the babies before they get to the babies and kill them. And so ultimately, the Pharaoh decides we're just going to have the soldiers go out and do this. They're beginning to kill all the little boys. And Moses is born during this time, and his mom doesn't want anything to happen to him. So she kind of hides him, keeps him under covers. But when he gets about 3 months old, he's apparently too big and too noisy to stay at home. And so they put him in a little basket. They put him out on the edge of the Nile River. They put his older sister around just to keep an eye on him, just to see how things go. And lo and behold, Pharaoh's daughter comes out to Nile one day, sees the baby, goes, oh, look at the baby. Oh, this must be a Jewish baby. But her heart goes out to him and thinks, I can't let my dad kill this baby, so I'm going to save this baby. In fact, she sees the girl and says, hey, find me. The girl says, hey, do you want me to find somebody to nurse the baby? Sure. So they work out the deal. She takes the baby back home. Her mother nurses the baby until he gets older. Then Pharaoh's daughter takes her into the home. He gets in there. And so the story of Moses starts like this. It goes from survival, just surviving a few months, to being spoiled. Because you can imagine if you went from like being a slave child to all of a sudden now you're one of Pharaoh's kids, right? And everything you want is at your control and command. And life is going not just good, it's going really good, right? It's those dreams that when we hear those lottery commercials, we go, where it says, just dream. It only costs, whatever it costs, a couple bucks to have all these dreams, right? Because we all have these dreams of how life would go. But Moses isn't just dreaming it, he's living it, right? But he goes from the whole survival to spoiled, then he goes to unsettled. Because when he gets in it seems like he gets roughly about 40 years old. So it takes him a while, let's be fair. It takes him a while. But he gets to the stage where he's uncomfortable because he knows a little bit of his background, and he knows that his people are getting worked harder and harder and harder, and he's really enjoying life really well. And that unsettledness leads him to saying something needs to be done. So Moses decides that here he is, one guy, he's going to do something. And so he catches an Egyptian guy beating a Jewish slave one day, and apparently it's not justified, or he just doesn't think it's right, and so he kills the Egyptian guy. And then the next day he comes out and he sees two Jewish guys fighting. And he says, hey, what are you guys doing? Why are you fighting each other? I mean, you got other guys that you ought to be fighting. Why are you fighting this, right? And they're like, well, hey, are you going to kill us too? To which he goes, oh no, this is not good. Because if they know, sometimes Pharaoh's going to know, and that's a no-no, right? So he goes from something needs to be done back to survival. Because he runs away, he goes out into this wilderness, he hangs around out there, he meets a woman, works to deal with her dad, they become husband and wife, and he goes from survival to sheep. For the next 40 years, he goes from the exciting world of having it all to sheep. Now, I don't know if you've ever taken care of sheep. I think most of us haven't, but we've probably seen pictures about them. They are very exciting animals. If you're watching them and you turn your head away for a second, you come back, they're exactly the same spot they were before, right? They just kind of slowly move from grass to grass to grass. But he spends 40 years. Here's this guy who's gone from, these heights. Now he spends his next 40 years. And what I love about Moses' story is he doesn't seem to be thrown off by that. This dramatic turn in life doesn't seem to kind of make you feel like he has no purpose or reason. This is what I'm here to do. This is where I'm put, and so I'm just going to do it. But then he goes from the sheep to being a savior for his people. He comes back, he doesn't really want to, and has this big experience with God. You ought to read about it. It's one of the best stories in the Bible of how God meets with him and convinces him he's the guy, and how he pushes against that. He goes back, he's this great savior of the people. He brings them out of Egypt. He goes back to Egypt, brings them out of Egypt. There's all these miracles that happen, these plagues, this terrible stuff that happens to people to sort of force Pharaoh to let this happen. They go out in this wilderness, and for 40 years, they go around and around and around and around on a trip that by worst case scenario should have taken no more than like 2 months. But it takes them 40 years. And then Moses, he gets to the end to being able to see but not enjoy, not getting to enjoy the finish line. That after all he's done, he doesn't get to go into the promised land. He just gets to see the promised land and drop the mic. And that's it for him. And I tell you all that because we don't know exactly when this prayer was written, but I imagine it's written much closer to the end. That we're told that Moses lived to be 120 years old, sort of 40-year sections of life. 40 years, in Egypt, 40 years taking care of sheep, 40 years coming back to Egypt, and then going around and around in this wilderness. And I tell you that for two reasons. One is for perspective and context. Because when we understand what somebody's gone through, it gives us some context for their life and even context for their words, right? It also gives us some perspective on the things they may have experienced and how that might have impacted how they think about things. And I tell you that because we're going to get into this prayer of Moses now. And the temptation for somebody like me is to pick the good parts out and skip the bad parts and act like they don't exist because nobody likes to explain the bad parts. But I figured, A, you're a smart group. I'm trying to butter you up. And B, you got to be honest about this stuff, right? And just picking and choosing stuff doesn't help us see them in the context of where they come. So here we go. You ready? If you want to follow along in your Bibles, you can. Otherwise, up here on the screen. Psalm 90 begins this way. Lord, again, it's a prayer, not a song, it's a prayer. Lord, you have been our home, our dwelling place since the beginning, from literally from all generations. God, you've kind of always been there. In fact, he goes on, before the mountains were born and before you created that has brought forth the earth and the world, you are God. Before everything we can kind of think and dream about, you were, right? And then I love the next line of his prayer. He says, listen, you have always been and you will always be. Which, if we're honest, it's hard for us to wrap our mind around, right? Because we all have a beginning and an ending. And even our relatives, you know, our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, right? We all know they have this beginning and ending, right? There's these bookmarks at each end of our lives. And everybody hearing this right now just has the start one, but we don't have the finish one, right? But Moses says, listen, we're talking about God who is different, dramatically different from us. That no matter how far we go back, you just got to keep going back, and you can never get there. And how far we go ahead, you can never get there. And so Moses says the perspective is we have this God who is different from us and obviously understands things differently because he is so different from us. And then Moses gives us one of those perspective statements. Again, based on the life that he's seen. And he says, God, you turn people back into dust. You say return, that is turn back human beings. This idea that it's not like God saying you, but it's like this is the process that you've set up. That we started as dust, right? If you read the biblical story, that's the kind of idea. We come up from the dirt and we end up going back to the dirt. And then another big perspective statement. He says, to you, God, not to us, but to you, 1,000 years is like the passing of a day. Or as he begins to think, you think that's probably not valuable because, you know, it's all about how your measurement, right? Because if eternity is like, how do you figure out where a year looks at that, right? He says, or it's like a few hours, a watch at night. And a watch was about a 3-hour shift. It's not like working graveyard. If you've ever worked graveyard, it's not like that's kind of a watch. It's like just for a 3-hour period. Everybody watches for 3 hours. But he says, to you, God, it's like this passing of a day, or 1,000 years is just like a 3-hour period at night. And oh, by the way, at night, while people sleep, you take their lives. Now, this isn't, and if you got kids, you need to tell them this. This doesn't mean, God sneaks in the night and takes them kind of thing. This is just talking about that. This is how things happen at times. That people go to sleep and they don't wake up. And again, this is a guy remember, this is somebody who's writing and praying from his perspective of what he's seen. And he has seen a lot of stuff. He's seen people who fell asleep and didn't wake up. He has seen people that God has sent plagues, terrible stuff. That God has stepped up to do some stuff to try to force some other things to happen. But just talking about people in general, he says, listen, they are like grass that is new in the morning. Something that pops up. And in the morning, they're fresh and new, but by evening, they fade and they wither. It's kind of one of those terrible life cycles, right? You know, there's some insects like that they have a 24-hour life cycle. They're born, they mate, and they die. Period. Now, you may be thinking, I know some people kind of like that, But even those people you know like that, it's sort of like a very simple life, isn't it? And kind of a sad life that could go happening so quickly. And here's the thing. Moses' point isn't that life doesn't matter. It's that if we could better come to grip with this tenuousness, we'd better come to grip with our place in this whole thing we call life. Moses is not kind of getting down and depressed here. He's just saying, God, as I pray, I'm being open and honest with you, right? I've seen people whose lives seem so short. I've seen people, even in that shortness of life, have a purpose, right? Grass that pops up in the start of the day and ends at the end of the day. There's a purpose to that. You've designed it. I don't understand it, but you've done all this stuff. But then Moses speaks again from his own perspective in his own context when he prays, God, we are destroyed. We are annihilated by your anger. We are terrified by your hot anger. To which, if we're honest, makes us all feel uncomfortable, right? We much rather like the God that loves us, the God that cares about us, that we're all good with, and that's part of God as well. But Moses has seen this other aspect of God, this side that you needed to be terrified of because he was trying to create something. And sometimes when you try to create stuff, what's the old saying? When you make an omelet, you got to break some eggs, right? Doesn't quite work, but it's something like that. But this idea that that he's seen God do some harsh things. And he's interpreted as God's anger towards doing these things. And it has terrified people. It's this, we got to stay in line or something bad might happen. And that's not necessarily the greatest way to develop something, but sometimes you have to have that before you can get to the other part. See, he goes on and says, you have put, that has set our guilt right in front of you. And Moses knows this again by experience. He's been in this spot, and when somebody in the group messed up, everybody got to know about it, and everybody sort of at times suffered from it, or at least a lot of people suffered from it. He says, you clearly see our secret, you clearly see our hidden sins. And don't think about this from your perspective, think about this from his perspective. Because this isn't our prayer, this is his prayer, okay? But Moses understands the impact that this idea of people's guilt, of their failures, of their mistakes, of their sins, of their willful disobedience, and what it's had, not just on them, but on others. It's why this group of people, for 40 years, had to go around and around and around in this desert. Stay here for a little bit, pick up and go camp over there for a little bit, go over here, we're going to stay for quite a while, then we're going to camp over here. You know, all of it was based on this, that we're constantly reminded that we're out here because some of us were knuckleheads. And we're all having to suffer for knuckleheads, which is not a new theme, right? Because all of us suffer from knuckleheads, right? Now, hopefully we're not the knuckleheads. Don't elbow anybody. But that's not a new thing, but it's just this reality that he says, we're reminded because from this religious context that there's a whole rationale behind this. And he goes on and says, listen, all our days pass while you're angry. And again, you ought to go back and read the story around Moses, because Moses doesn't live his life like God is always angry. Moses lives his life like God can get angry. And he's expressed that anger. Moses has been the one who says, no, don't take out your anger on the people. Take it out on me, but leave them alone, right? And there's theologians will talk about that they think it was a development thing, and it may have been a development thing for Moses and his leadership. But Moses knows what this feels like. Our years, he goes on, end with a moan, a sigh. Because again, if you've been going around in the desert for 40 years, not getting to where you hope to get, there comes a moment when you wonder about what's the purpose of this whole thing. And then he says the line that if you've been around a place like this, you've probably heard. This is the one that people like me love to grab out and just talk about this one. So this is going to get really good for just a moment, all right? Here's what he says. Our lifetime is 70 years, or if you're strong, 80. Which you may be thinking, Mike, that doesn't sound like the good part. But it's sort of this kind of perspective that, okay, there's the bookend. That in general, this is how it works, but we know that this is a general statement, not a specific statement, because we all know people that didn't make it to 70, and we all know people that made it well beyond 80, right? But he's just giving us some things. He says, in general, this is kind of where people fall into, 70 or 80 years. I mean, Moses is pushing, he gets to 120, so he's got a big step on all of these folks. But he says, listen, the years are full of hard work and pain. They're full of toil and trouble. And I love that, because isn't that at times true in your life? I mean, it's kind of, let's be honest, it's part of the life that at times kind of wears on some of us. There's like this idea that life is about toil and trouble, and we think, when is it going to get better? And some of us, for whatever reason, seem to be sort of stuck in that cycle, right? Toil and trouble. It's one or the other at the moment. And others of us get little breaks away from those things. Sometimes it's like toil, but it's not like hard toil. And the trouble is just like, the car tire's flat. That's not a big trouble thing, right? But he says, I love how he says that. He says, even those things, God, they pass quickly, and then we're gone. Remember, this is a prayer. He's not trying to teach anything. He's not trying to sing anything. This is just his prayer that somehow he thought was valuable to get recorded and somebody thought was valuable for us to read. And then he makes a statement again based on his own context and perspective of what he's seen and what he's experienced. And he says, who knows? Who knows the full power? Who knows the full strength of your anger? And the implication is we don't. Because I don't think anybody in this space, and probably anybody watching online, has seen the amount of anger that Moses saw from God. And it wasn't sort of this blackout, blinded anger. It was a controlled anger. It was a specific anger. But he saw these plagues happen. He saw God do this miracle of opening up this big body of water, right? And then closing it up and killing hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers. He saw, the people that were his people out in the desert, and they did some stuff, and that God opened up the ground and swallowed them up. Moses saw some stuff. And again, don't be thinking back to us in this. Think about where he's coming from. Even Moses saying, listen, who knows? None of us really know that. Moses saying he's seen it comes that thankful you and I haven't seen, and he's like, you have no idea how bad I've seen it, and I don't even know the full extent of it all. And then he makes this, what I think is probably his best perspective and context statement in this whole thing. And he says, listen, your anger, God, your anger is as great as our fear of you should be. And let me put this in a way that I think will make a little more sense to us. I think the translation of that is simply this, that if we could see God as he is, we would give him the reverence he is due. That this isn't be afraid of me and so follow me kind of thing. But if we could understand God in all of his fullness, or at least as much as we could handle, his love that it sometimes has anger to it. Because if you're a parent of a child, especially if you're a mother, you know that you love your child, and there's a moment when anger can come out. What do they call it? Mama bear syndrome? Is something like that? Right? If something happens to that baby, whoo, right? Because she's going to do something. And that's loving anger. That's not just anger, right? I mean, there may be a little anger to it, depending on what the whole story is. But right, there's this piece. But he's saying, listen, if we could understand that we're not immune from that, we even have a little sense of that. But God comes from a whole different perspective. But if we could somehow see him as he is, that it would do something in us. This idea of awe and of fear and of response. And maybe if we could see more clearly, we would live more purposefully. Because let's be honest, it's easy at times to kind of forget what he talks about there, right? Let's not talk about God's anger. Let's talk about God's love, right? Jesus loves me when I'm good. When I do the things I should. Jesus loves me when I'm bad, even though it makes him, but he still loves me, right? And that's true. But, yes. And then Moses goes to the other line that, again, people like me love to this is one we could just talk about this for the whole time and have forgotten this other stuff, and we would all been feeling much better than at this moment. Because here's what he says. God, teach us, that is, make us know how short our lives really are, to count our days so that we may be wise. If you're thinking about this, you've heard this before, it's more like, God, teach us to number our days, right? So that we can grow a heart of wisdom, I think is how the translation a lot of us grew up with. Teach us to number our days. But the reason to do all that, notice he says, so that we may be wise. And the reality is, wisdom comes from perspective and context. And here's what I've discovered about perspective and context. We only get them when we've experienced them. It's why some of you and your daughter, she's 11 or 12 years old, and she's heartbroken that crummy little boy broke up with her after dating a whole 2 weeks. And we laugh, right? We laugh because we have perspective, right? We have experience. It kind of goes, right? She doesn't have that. And so for us to say those things we think are going to be helpful. Well, sweetheart, there are lots of fish in the sea. But I don't want to fish, right? And we think it's going to be helpful. Oh, there'll be plenty of more that'll come. But she doesn't have that perspective, right? And the context. We have the context again that perspective gives us, right? The context of how life has worked. And so wisdom really comes from the perspective and the context. And the truth is, if we lived in light of the fact that our time is limited, we might make better decisions. That's where wisdom comes out, right? Having this perspective that time is limited. And the truth of the matter is, we've all at times numbered our days. It is a part of life. It's not a religious part of life. It is just a part of life. How many of you ever celebrated a birthday? Some of you have been 29 for like decades. We don't round up, we always round down, right? Anniversaries, we number our days, right? We count about those things. We celebrate those things, who would have thought we would have made it to, I have some friends. Every time I see them, she always jokes, she says, you never thought we'd make it a year. And I'm like, no, I didn't. And I'm not a betting man, but I would have put money on that. I would have lost money, right? But we number those things, right? If you've ever been around a bride and an impending wedding, there's numbering of days, right? It's like, how long to your wedding? It's like, 23 days, 45 hours, 6 minutes. They got it nailed down to the exact science, right? And in that we know the time because we know all the stuff that has to get done with the time, and there is never enough time for a wedding. That's the thing I've learned about doing lots of weddings, right? Everybody's like still scrambling, even if they've been planning for years. Have you ever faced a major exam, right? You have numbered your days, and there is never enough days, right? A big job interview, right? You're counting, man. What else do I got to do? If you've ever had a closing, right? Those you ever bought a house, and you're kind of waiting, and stuff isn't going to work out. It's like, it's going to happen. A major surgery, counting down, and some of us get real nervous before that. Some are like really calm until we're actually in that little back room where they're getting us prepped, and we're like, oh, baby, right? We number our days. If you've ever gone home to see your mom or dad for one last time. When your parents get older, those are the times when you begin in your little head to number your days. Begin to think, is this the last time I might see them? Even though they're in good health right now. Because we don't know. And parents, you have a sort of a built-in numbering system. And some of you who love this system, right? We have 18 years. 18 years by the government that I am responsible for you, but 18 years when it gets up. Right? Some of you are looking forward to that. Some of you aren't looking forward to that because you're like, wow, I've been so used to having them around, what it's going to look like. And I know we have some families right now that in the summer are making that transition, right? Kids have graduated high school, going off to college, and it's like life has changed dramatically. And in those 18 years, there are 6,574.5 days. I love 0.5. I was thinking about that. It's like, you told your kid you got 18 years, and then you're out, right? And you're like, the 6,574th day, you wake up in the morning, and they wake up about 11 o'clock in the morning. And you're like, okay, you're going to be awake from 11 to like 3 o'clock in the morning and say, hey, let's just say, 6 o'clock tonight when this all finishes, right? But it still sounds like a lot. Thousands, right? But when you break it down to like weeks, 938.571, which again, I love the details of this, right? But when you get down to months, 216 months. And our numbering kind of changes when we get smaller, doesn't it? And let me just hit you with a real harsh thing, parents. You get 18 birthdays. You get 18 spring breaks. You get 18 summers. You get 18 Christmases. And the question I would encourage you as a parent to ask is simply this: where are you at? And I mean that in two ways. One is, where are you at in the number of it, right? Because if you're on number 14, that means you have, right? And where are you at in that whole cycle of things? Because my experience has been that most parents begin to recognize how fast life is going when their kids hit about middle school. And all of a sudden they're trying to put on the brakes and hold things back, and by then it is, enough of that depressing stuff. Let's get back to this, right? Back to Moses, who was much better, right? Here we go. Lord, how long before you turn and show kindness, compassion to your servants? I love his prayer turns from this, recognition of just this perspective and context about how tough life is and how I've seen a lot of stuff and I've seen your anger and tried to make sense of all this. My prayer now is just simply a question: how long? Because again, Moses has seen, while he's seen God's compassion, he's also seen a lot of toughness in that compassion. I mean, can you imagine camping for 40 years? I know some of you love camping, but even you have to be going, that's a little bit of a stretch, right? You might go for like a month and then you're like glad to get back, but 40 years. How long is this going to last? How long do you turn, right? How long this goes in the other direction? How long till we get to the promised land? Because obviously this was prayed before they got to the promised land, because again, Moses doesn't make it to the promised land. Then his prayer goes, listen, God, let us satisfy us with your love, with your loyalty every morning. He turns it now to a sort of a big finish, right? God, the thing I can pray for as I wait for you to answer how long is simply to pray that you would not just fill us, but satisfy with that filling of your love, of your loyalty, because loyalty implies that you're committed to us. And I know that you love us and you're committed to us, but help us be satisfied with that commitment each day. Then, I love what he says, then we will sing and rejoice all our lives. We'll have this great response when we finally get to the thing that we've been hoping for like a long, long time. Because truth is, God, we have seen years of trouble. And actually, the word there translated can be hurt. We've seen lots of years of hurt. Now give us as many days of joy as you gave us sorrow. Now you may be thinking, that's pretty bold of him, isn't it? I mean, kind of saying, God, hey, God, you have been sticking it to us for a long, long time. Enough's enough. Hey, come on, when's the payoff going to be, right? Now give us as much good stuff as you've given us bad stuff. But you have to understand, and again, this is Moses, this isn't Mike, this isn't you. But Moses has seen some stuff. He's experienced stuff. Moses has one of the great stories. You need to go back and read this, of just how he and God's relationship develops. He goes from, no, God, I'm not your guy. I'm not the man. I'm not your man. Pick somebody else. Not me, to, he stands in the place and says, God, why did you give me these people? They're driving me crazy. And God's like, be patient, right? And the other times God's like, I'm sorry for giving you these people. I'm going to take care of them. He's like, no. We're going to work this out. Let me handle it, God. Let me just kind of go out. He develops this thing, but in that midst of all that, he has seen some really hard stuff. And now we're saying, hey, when are we going to get the good stuff? He goes on, listen, show your servants the wonderful things you do. Show us your miracles. Show your greatness, your splendor to their children, right? Not just for us, but their kids. We want our kids to believe in the kind of God that we believe in. Or maybe we haven't seen as much of. Lord, our God, treat us well. Favor us is the language there. Favor us. Because we know what it's like to be not favored. We be liking a little favoring right now, right? And he closes his prayer with these words. Give us success in what we do. Yes, give us success in what we do. And when he's praying for success, he's not praying for success as you and I would pray for success. Because for us, success looks a whole lot different than success looked for him. We think of cars. They thought of mules. We think of houses, property. They think of a better tent than the one they've been dragging around for 40 years. But Moses, again, in his perspective and his context, knows that when he prays for success here, what he's praying for is meaning. Help us find meaning. Help us know that there's meaning in what we do. And that's why I pray twice about this. God, give us success in what we do. Help us find meaning in what we do, right? Help us be successful, because then we know there's been a purpose to our lives. Because at times it's easy to ask this question, what's the point? And when we think from our context, what's the point? Let's be honest. When we're young, we think we are. And do you know why we think we are? Because we are. That's exactly right. You get a baby, you bring them home. I told you this before. I love both my boys had the same response when they brought their babies home from the hospital the first time. They both said, they thought to themselves, what are these people thinking giving me this baby to take home? I have no idea what to do here, right? And of course, everything becomes about the baby, right? The baby cries, does all this kind of stuff. And that hangs on for a while, till at some point, at least most of us realize we're not the point, right? Most of us, because all of us probably have that friend who's like, still, life's all about them, and it's just kind of crazy. How can they get to that age and think it's all about them still, but they're there, right? But just think about the life cycles that we all go through. We're born, we cry, we eat, we fill a diaper, we go to school, we go to more school, maybe more school, we get a job. At least your parents are praying that you get a job, right? Maybe you date. Maybe you marry. Maybe you don't. Maybe 2 or 3 times. Maybe you have kids. If you do, they grow up. Hopefully you retire. You get to play golf. You get to travel. Maybe you work at Walmart. Then you get old, you get sick, and you die. And here's the crazy thing. Everybody's story is some version of that story. That's kind of an American one. But if you're from the Caribbean, I think you probably got a version of that. If you're from Europe, you got a version of that. South America, you got a version of that. Africa, you got a version of that. Asia, you got a version of that. I don't want to miss out anybody, but I'm going to, so just forget it. But you got a version of that, right? Some version of that. But here's the thing that happens in that version of that. At some point, and I don't want you to miss, this is going to be really deep. Some of you are going to have to think about it. Some of you are going to have to press pause for just a second to catch this. So you may want to get your phones out to take a picture of this, because this may be something you need to think about later. Are you ready? At some point, we realize that while we're 1 in a million, we're 1 in a million. Yeah, thanks, John. Take a picture of that, because you need to think that one through, right? Because we all think, we've heard, we're so special, all this stuff, and then we recognize, no, we're kind of special because a lot of people are special. And here's the truth, based on what Moses prayed about, right? We all have an expiration date. In fact, I believe not only do we have an expiration date, we also have a best if used by date. And here's the problem with those. We don't know when it is. It isn't like on our back where somebody can, scan it for us and look at us and read it to us, right? And that makes life hard because it's like, do I get the 70 or 80 years that Moses talked about? Do I get the 16 that a kid I went to high school with got? Do I give 33 years that another friend of mine had? And if you want to do something fun that's really uplifting, there's a website called deathclock.org. Yeah, and I did it this week, so here's where I'm at in this thing, a little self-disclosure. Based on our calculations, you will die Sunday, 29th November of 2037. So right around Thanksgiving in 2037, life is not going to be so good in the Speegle home. You will live to be 79 years, 0 months, and 29 days old, which means, that's kind of like not quite the 80, but probably I'm strong enough, almost 80, right? Yeah, I don't know what they base it on, but it was better than saying I got like a year or something, so, But here's the truth, folks. Listen, our time is shorter every day. And our time is limited. And we wish so much we knew how limited it was, right? Because we would say, hey, I would change how I would live today if I knew I only had this long, right? But what if Moses reminds us that Moses reminds us of that, not to cause fear, but to lead us to appreciation? What if Moses' whole point about how time is short isn't so much about like, I don't know when I'm dying, so I have to kind of squeeze it all in. But what if it's about appreciation? Appreciation of life, of time in general. Because reality is time is our most valuable asset. Yet there's something more valuable. And what's more valuable is knowing what to do with our time. Author, speaker, pastor Andy Stanley, I thought has a great insight to this. Somebody says, listen, we can become so obsessed with what's next that we miss the now. Right? And by missing the now, we often miss what's next, which is kind of this crazy cycle we find ourselves in. And every day we make choices to give up something in order to gain something else. And as we wind this towards the end, here's a question I want us to just consider. What if we're giving up the wrong things for the wrong things? See, what if the answer isn't more time, but a greater awareness, a greater appreciation of the time we have? So today I'm going to give you some homework. Everybody say yay. Yay. Good crowd, yeah. So here's what I want you to try this week. This week, choose one thing that you regularly waste time on. Because there's something we all regularly waste time on, right? If you don't know, ask somebody close to you. I'm sure they can come up with something, right? So choose the one thing that you regularly waste time on, and here's what I want you to do. Stop it. Just this week, but just for this week, stop it, all right? And maybe thinking, Mike, I can't stop it. Yeah, just for this week. You don't have to do it for the rest of your life, but just for this week, stop it, all right? And there's a flip side to it. I want you to choose one thing you value but don't do enough. Again, if you don't know, ask somebody close to you, right? Because I'm sure they can come up with something, all right? And once you choose the one thing that you value but don't do enough, then just do it. Do it more this week, all right? Again, I'm not asking for a lifetime commitment. This is not a till death do us part kind of thing. It's just for this week, for a week. Stop it and do it. Because what if a small change could lead to a lasting breakthrough? Because what if slowing down isn't time's job? What if slowing down is our job? Something to think about.